Good morning, it's Monday the 12th of September. As we look at this week's economic highlights, as we always do every Monday morning, we just wanted to start with our own tribute to Her Majesty the Queen. The face that for most of our entire lifetimes has adorned our banknotes and coinage, our stamps, been our head of state, our constitutional monarch, a presence as familiar to us as a member of our own family, has finally left us. And like losing a favourite grandmother, her passing has left a painful emptiness in our collective national psyche. But 96 glorious years should be celebrated, not mourned. And as our Queen is laid to rest, we raise our own small but heartfelt salute to the great rock of our age, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. But of course, business this week carries on in its own measured way, so let's take a look at what the week brings. The economic numbers being issued this week start today with the release of the UK's latest GDP figures. On Tuesday, we'll hear the latest UK unemployment, the German CPI figures, the German ZEW economic sentiment. We'll also hear the latest CPI figures in the US, which we'll talk about straight after this. On Wednesday, here in the UK, our own CPI figures are released, and again, we'll take a look at these in more detail afterwards. Wednesday also brings updates on the Eurozone industrial production figures and PPIs over in the US. Thursday sees the release of Australian unemployment numbers and retail sales in the US, and the latter of which we'll discuss shortly. And on Friday, the latest retail sales figures over in China are revealed, and we'll give our thoughts on that at the end of today's video. Also on Friday, we'll hear the latest UK retail sales figures, inflation in the Eurozone, and the latest US Michigan confidence numbers. And the companies that we'll hear trading updates from this week start today with Oracle. On Tuesday, Ocado are due to release Q3 results, and we'll discuss those in a moment. And also on Tuesday, Fevertree. Home furnishings retailer Dunelm are due to release their preliminary annual results on Wednesday. We'll give our thoughts on this afterwards. Also on Wednesday, we'll hear from Inditex, Tullow Oil and Redrow. And on Thursday, we'll hear from Renishaw, THG, and finally Adobe are due to release their Q3s on Thursday, which again we'll discuss towards the end of today's video. As the UK, and indeed the world, mourn the loss of Queen Elizabeth, the Bank of England has postponed its monetary policy meeting to September the 22nd. Data will still be released, giving the Bank of England another week to digest inflation, GDP and jobs data. US inflation, retail sales and the Michigan confidence will also be closely watched ahead of the FOMC meeting next week. So let's take a look at this week's big stories in more detail. Ocado is due to report Q3 results on Tuesday as the share price trades at its lowest level in 4 years, and the firm continues struggling to convince investors of its ability to turn a profit. Earlier in the year, Ocado downgraded its outlook due to the rising cost of raw materials, energy and products. And while the online grocer said prices would also rise, they did fail to clarify if the higher prices would indeed offset the rising costs. Revenue was down 8% in the first half of the year as the pandemic effect continued to fade, and customers reined in spending, a trend which could continue across the rest of the year. Tuesday also sees the release of the latest consumer price inflation figures in the US. Well, US CPI cooled to 8.5% year-on-year in July, down from 9.1% in June, thanks to lower petrol prices, but remained close to multi-decade highs. The slowing in inflation prompted expectations that the Fed could rein in its aggressive hawkish stance, maybe even with a rate cut next year. In his hawkish speech at Jackson Hole, Powell poured cold water on expectations of a less hawkish Fed. With Fed speakers now in the blackout period ahead of the September FOMC, all eyes will of course be on inflation. Well, there have been tentative signs in the economy that inflation could be cooling, as seen in the Fed's Beige book. Crude oil prices have also fallen around 18% since the start of August. Expectations are for CPI to fall 0.1% month on month in August, after seeing 0% change in July. Even if CPI does ease, the Fed is still likely to hike by 75 basis points in September, but could be less aggressive in subsequent months. On Wednesday, home furnishings retailer Dunelm are due to report preliminary annual results. In an update in July, Dunelm reported a 16% rise in sales to £1.55 billion in the year to June 25. And pre-tax profits were slightly ahead of forecast at £297 million, firmly ahead of the £158 million last year. Sales in Q4 were slower, falling 6% year-on-year to £358 million. Still, Dunelm said that trading in the new fiscal year had got off to a good start. While Dunelm recovered well from the pandemic, sales could start to slow as consumers cut back on discretionary spending, as a result of the cost of living crisis. These concerns are reflected in the share price, which has lost around half of its value so far this year and trades at levels last seen in the depth of the pandemic. Wednesday also sees the release of the latest CPI figures here in the UK. Well, UK CPI inflation rose to 10.1% year-on-year in July, up from 9.4% in June, owing to rising food and fuel prices. Core CPI, which excludes more volatile items such as food and fuel, rose to 6.2% year-on-year, and that's up from 5.8%, which is likely to be a concern for policymakers at the Bank of England. Last month, the bank raised interest rates by 50 basis points, taking the benchmark lending rate to 1.75%, and is expected to hike rates again by at least 50 basis points, if not 75 basis points. It's worth noting that the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey said this week that the government's new energy relief bill could help inflation slow. The UK Central Bank said that it does expect interest rates to rise to 13% in the coming months. The bank's monetary policy meeting was planned for this week. However, owing to the period of national mourning, this will now be held on the following week, September the 22nd. And finally, on Wednesday, the US are due to release their latest retail sales figures. Well, the US consumer has proved resilient despite prices soaring and disposable incomes falling. In the first 6 months of the year, retail sales rose each month except May. In July, retail sales were unchanged after rising 0.8% in June. Some of the resilience in the US consumer is likely to stem from the strength of the US labour market, as job creation has remained very strong. That said, it is also worth highlighting that credit spending has risen significantly, which could suggest that the high levels of spending are unsustainable. Expectations are for retail sales to rise 0.3% month-on-month in August. US software company Adobe are due to release their Q3s on Thursday. Well, in Q2, Adobe reported strong revenue growth of 14% year-on-year to $4.39 billion and profits of $3.35 a share. However, the software firm downwardly revised its Q3 revenue guidance to $4.43 billion, and this was below expectations of $4.52 billion. The full-year revenue forecast was also downwardly revised to $17.65 billion. That's from $17.9 billion after Adobe pulled out of Russia and Ukraine, and owing, of course, to the strong dollar. Given the macro headwinds, which have intensified since then, risks of another downward revision are building. Wall Street is expected revenue to rise 13% in Q3 to a new record high of $4.43 billion, and adjusted earnings per share expected to rise 7.2% to $3.33. And finally on Friday, China are due to release their latest retail sales figures. Concerns over the health of the Chinese economy have grown in recent weeks as data disappoints and COVID lockdown restrictions are rising yet again. After lockdown restrictions were eased earlier in the year, consumer spending recovered, growing 3.1% year-on-year in June and 2.7% in July. More recently, as lockdown restrictions rise again, Beijing has looked to rein in growth expectations this month. This week, Chinese retail sales will provide further insight into the Chinese consumer, with sales expected to rise 3.1% year-on-year in August, after missing forecasts in July. So those are the big stories of the week. Let's wrap up with a quick look at the dividend announcements due out this week. In the FTSE 100, we'll hear from Unite Group, Intertek and Melrose. And in the FTSE 250, we'll hear from TBC Bank, Balance Commercial Property, International Public Partnership and Energene. So there you have it, a sombre week as the UK and indeed the world mourns the passing of our Queen. On behalf of Atlantic Capital Markets, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.